have with us Dr. Matthew McVarish, who is a Scottish actor, activist, writer, and also a survivor of childhood sexual abuse. We are going to talk about childhood sexual abuse and the journey of Dr. Matthew McVarish from being a survivor of CSA to the activist and a writer. We will explore all different aspects of your journey.
Cool. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me on this talk.
Thank you so much for joining me today in this talk. I'm really happy that we can have this conversation. I know Dr. McVarish from 5-6 years now, when you had finished your Road to Change project, 10,000 miles of walk in all the EU capitals in European Union. We will talk about that more as well. But I also remember that I saw your film To Kill the Kelpie before I met you at the Scottish Parliament. But again, we'll talk about all that. So why don't you go ahead and tell us something about yourself, your Road to Change project, and then we will get into your experiences as a survivor.
Yes, so I think we met about 6 years ago at the end of the 10,000 mile walk that I did around Europe, around the EU. And that was a project that had kind of grown out of a number of things. And partly it grew out of the fact that I started my career as an actor and writer. And I'd written a play based on my own childhood experience of being sexually abused by my uncle. And the play, the performance of the play kind of led to the actual arrest of my uncle in real life, because up until that point, my brothers and I had never actually spoken about the abuse. So the play, it was based on my life, but it was fictional, you know. It became a catalyst for a discussion within our family. And in a sense, I'm not sure if we hadn't had that piece of art. A play is just a piece of art. If that hadn't happened at that time, I don't know how much longer it would have taken us to finally speak about it. But yeah, so the play eventually became a film, and we showed that around the world. And what we began to notice, that when people saw the film or the play, it did catalyze the same discussion for them. Many people told me, often for the very first time, that they had also been abused. And so I realized that this story was helping people talk about something that's very hard to talk about. This led to the idea of walking around Europe to try and increase awareness of abuse. It seems in the UK that it's on television all the time, but in other parts of Europe, it's really still not discussed at all. So that project was primarily about forcing a discussion, but it was also focused on legislation. When I got to each government in each country, I would ask them to remove the Statute of Limitations. So that project finished in 2015, and then after that, I've done various national and global things.
Yes, we will come to that definitely. I need to know. I know about your journey, but we'll get into that. But as of now, I guess because you started with Road to Change and how you started that project as an outcome of all that happened in your personal life, your own journey as a survivor. So would you like to talk a little more about that, about your childhood and what you went through, and how did you then, we would talk about it as we move on, that how your journey then from, say, victim to the survivor, and then to actually activist and doing something about it. So wherever you want to start from and start sharing your journey. But before I get to you, Dr. Matthew McVarish, I want to start with the line from your book, which we will also talk about later, that if listening to this interview becomes too much, don't worry. I want to tell the viewers that they can just put it down, as you say in your book, or stop the recording and come back to it whenever they feel ready, because there could be parts which may be emotional or upsetting or disturbing. So yeah, don't feel compelled that you have to listen to it at that moment. So over to you.
So I grew up in Scotland. I grew up in a suburb of Glasgow, and it's a very predominantly Catholic community. And I'm the youngest of 7, so quite a large family. And so my uncle, who was my godfather, he began sexually abusing me when I think I was about 3 or 4. It's very hard to kind of place exactly when the first instances were. And this went on until I was 13. So it stopped on the 24th of March 1996. And I know that specifically because that was the day when I finally stood up to him and said, "You can't touch me anymore." Even though at that point the abuse stopped after all those years, I didn't tell anyone. But I think because I was in a Catholic high school and my family, you know, like in the recent decade, there's been a lot of scandal around the Catholic Church and priests abusing children. And one person asked me, you know, do you think this is a uniquely Catholic problem? And it really isn't. It happens in all cultures and all religions and all institutions. But I do think there are aspects of a Catholic household that make talking about something like sexual abuse very, very difficult. And it's also very similar in other conservative families as well. There's different reasons. But so for me, it was about, I didn't want to tell anyone what my uncle did because I knew even when I was like a teenager that it would probably have to go to court. I'd probably have to tell the police. And for me, that would create a big drama that would, you know, put a lot of stress into my family and my mother. And at that time, I still felt that, you know, it would be very shameful. So, you know, I didn't say anything to anyone. But when I was 15, so 2 years after the abuse finished, my elder brother, who was 10 years older than me, so he was 25 years old, he was at university, and he basically had a complete emotional collapse and he ended up in hospital. He couldn't function. And he was under a lot of stress at university, but pretty much what happened was he couldn't think straight anymore because he was so unwell. And when I went to visit him in hospital, he said that he'd been abused by our uncle. And at that moment, that was the first time I realized that it wasn't just me. I always thought it was just me. So now I just learned that it happened to my older brother. In conversations that happened after this, I learned that it happened to 2 more of my brothers. So when all 4 of us had been sexually abused by my uncle. And it's desperately sad that this was going on because my mother had been sexually assaulted when she was a child from the story that I gathered, she was sexually assaulted by a plumber who was in their house. And my mum was born in the 40s, so this would have been sometime in the early 50s. And the plumber was a friend of my grandfather, and he was doing some work in their home, and they were left alone, and he assaulted her. And so that experience that my mother had meant that she was very, very careful with my sisters. I have 2 sisters. And growing up, my mum never let any men certainly, be alone with my 2 sisters to make sure they were safe. It never occurred to her that her boys could also be vulnerable. And I think when it all got disclosed that 4 of us had been sexually assaulted repeatedly throughout our childhood by her own brother, she was absolutely devastated, like completely heartbroken, especially because she had tried to be vigilant her whole life. But at that time, even though it was now kind of everyone in our family certainly was aware of what had happened, the only action that we took was that we stopped our uncle ever coming back into our house. So we just stopped him being in contact with us. And that's where we kind of left it for about 10 years. And in those 10 years, I went off to university, I became an actor and then became a writer. And it got to the point that I realized that my uncle, who we knew what he did, but we weren't talking about it, he was still working as a school teacher, you know, and I think he used to volunteer to help football teams of young boys. Now, we knew he was dangerous and we knew what he was capable of, and we were literally the only ones who knew, but we weren't saying anything. And we weren't saying anything because we were feeling shame and stress. But that was when I kind of decided to write the play. And the play wasn't, it didn't name any names. It was just a play about adult brothers who'd been abused in childhood. And in the play, they come together and speak about it for the first time. And when we put the production on, I invited my brothers to come and see it. I also invited Sandra Brown, who I believe you've already spoken with.
Yes, we interviewed her last time.
The Moira Anderson Foundation. And I wanted her to be present and her organisation because they support adult survivors of childhood sexual abuse specifically.
Mhm.
And I knew that my play might be triggering for people in the audience, and particularly my brothers. And Sandra actually hosted a post-show discussion after one night. It was on for a while, but it was one of the performances. She was there, and that discussion was really the catalyst for us and the family to realize that we need to do something. And Sandra was very gracious. She said, you know, I understand that it's very, very difficult, but the longer that you don't say anything to the police, you know, the more children continue to be in danger. So it really wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about criminal damages compensation that you might be entitled to. I didn't actually know we were entitled to compensation from the government. It was just about child protection. That was why we finally made a police report. And when that happened, I was already I was working on television. I was in a children's TV show, and I was anxious that, you know, even though I was the victim when I was a child, I wasn't sure how it was going to look to have a kids TV star in the newspapers about having been abused and stuff. You know, but I think I came to realize that you start to need to use your voice. You know, you kind of have to just go. You get to the point when you realize you haven't done anything wrong, and there is no shame for you, the victim. The shame is all with the offender.
Yeah.
So, and that's kind of where I began after the play, when we toured the play, and I would talk to the audience and afterwards, and that's kind of how I made the transition from being an actor and writer into starting to be an activist and someone who was speaking out and campaigning for, I guess, the end of silence around this issue. Yeah, I think that brings us up to that point.
Right. Okay. Thank you so much. I know you've been talking about your experiences and raising awareness around child sexual abuse, but thank you for sharing this here in this talk. And I see you've raised so many important aspects that I would like to talk about. So like you started talking about the whole element of silence, like why people don't like not being able to speak about it. And I think child sexual abuse is shrouded by silence and secrecy, and that's where it kind of thrives. So I would like to discuss that about the silence, and then how did you break that silence. The other aspect that I think you raised, and again, a very, very significant aspect, is sexual abuse of boys in your family. Like you said, your mother protected the girls, but 4 boys were sexually abused. And again, there's a big myth around that boys don't get abused. And also, of course, the data shows us that there are boys who are getting abused, but number of girls who are getting abused is more than boys. But again, this is an element that I would like to discuss further. Um, and of course, you talked about shame, and which is again a big aspect associated with sexual abuse, shame, stress, and that so many times stops the victims or the survivors to go out and talk about it, because again, they are feeling the shame and feeling blamed or feeling guilty about it. And again, then you said something about that there comes a point where you realize that it's not you who's wrong or who's at fault. It's probably not probably, for sure, the offender who's at fault. So these are all these elements. And also then you talked about Terry, your offender, and the legal case around and how he then got imprisoned for that. So these are all different aspects that I would like to discuss in detail, because it might help other survivors to hear from your experiences, and how did you take all those steps, and then may inspire others to come out with it as well. But I think I'll probably end this segment here, so that, again, taking from your book, I'm borrowing a lot today from your book, that again, asking my viewers to take a deep breath, breathe in, breathe out, to reflect upon what you've shared right now, and kind of come back for the other segment whenever they feel ready, because we are going to talk a lot more about all the different aspects that you raised. So I'll see you in the next segment.
Wonderful.